I'm Dean Newland, and welcome to Leadovation. Reimagine, facilitate, flourish. This podcast is dedicated to the art and science of innovative leadership. Through insightful interviews with industry experts, I bring you cutting-edge strategies and experiences of innovative leadership, helping you think differently, act strategically, and achieve remarkable results. Join me as I provide insights and tools that empower you to make smarter decisions, forge meaningful relationships. Welcome to Leadovation. Those of you who have been involved in sports understand the importance of what you might call stacking and correctly sequencing skills. For example, as a lad, I was a high school ski racer, and our coach, his name was Mr. DiNucci. I think we were the only high school in the city of Minneapolis that had an Italian ski racing coach. Anyway, Mr. DiNucci had us first build cardiovascular endurance by running up and down stairs, and then focus on practicing our carving skills on the slopes. A great athletic coach achieves peak performance in their athletes by designing the proper stacking and sequencing of skills during practice. And in business, however, we often provide employees who want to improve their leadership skills with a variety of resources, but leave it up to them to reverse engineer how to apply those skills effectively. And this hit or miss approach to leadership development overlooks the importance of designing and sequencing new skills in the right way. Well, my next guest on Leadovation is Christian Muntean. Christian is an advisor to owners, executives, and boards. As the founder of Vantage Consulting, he has helped owners and executives of small and mid-sized businesses boost their top-line revenue by over $500 million. More importantly, they've achieved this growth while expanding their bottom line margins and reclaiming precious time for their families and passions. Christian is also an author. His most recent book, Train to Lead, is a tested and proven 90-day leadership development guide inspired by athletic training principles. Christian Muntean on the Leadovation podcast. So, Christian, it's great to have you on the show. And I know that you are, like myself, kind of a nerd when it comes to leadership. But it seems like a lot of people are nerds when it comes to leadership. That leadership development, leadership resources, TED Talks. Heck, yesterday I was just reading another article about leadership from the Harvard Business Review. Leadership shows up all the time. In fact, it's probably one of the most popular topics on this podcast. And I think it's fantastic. But one of the things that I've noticed, and I know that when you and I were talking about this before we hit the record button, that there is a lot of data out there. There's a lot of information about leadership, but we don't really know what works. And we don't really know how to apply all this. I mean, like if we can read a book and go, I got one idea out of this, and maybe I can translate this into my own behavior, maybe reverse engineer it and make it stick for me, yay for me, right? But I got the feeling based on our conversation that you've got a different approach, and I'd like to hear more about it and to see your take on this very popular topic around leadership.
Yeah, no, I'm glad to be here, Dean. I would argue that we do know what works. What we don't know how to do is how to help a new leader or even an experienced leader that wants to refine their skill set know how to do that in a kind of a predictable, planned way.
So then you told me earlier that you draw on that insight from your background in athletics. So could you, certainly we use the word coach ubiquitously across those two different domains. But what did you learn from athletics that you've been able to apply into a business leadership development process?
Yeah. So I spent my life in athletics, really. And even now, just as an amateur, I practice Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and strength training and so on.
Oh, good for you.
But for about 12 years, I was a strength and conditioning instructor. Did it as a kind of a side gig. I was just training at a gym, and there was actually the instructor for the fire department was teaching the classes at the gym, and I just loved how hard he pushed people, but was still able to be nice and create a welcoming environment. So I took the classes in part just to learn that from him because I was already doing this work. Anyways, I ended up taking over the classes. He left and never came back, and he asked me to fill in for him, and I just became an instructor. Did that for 12 years. The One day as I was driving home from the gym, I thought, why is it that we can predictably prepare an athlete? I worked with a lot of athletes and military, and so I could predictably prepare somebody for whatever it was they needed to the day that they needed it. Like you could build out the training program, and you knew that they were going to be peaked out right before they needed to be able to use whatever they had built into. And I thought, why is it we can do that when we know so little really about how the body works? Like it's still a lot of it's kind of guesswork. But when it comes to leadership, which has been studied extensively for a long time, we do know a lot of things around it. It still always seems to be, here's a fire hose of ideas and concepts. Now don't screw up. And that's the typical support that somebody will get as they're getting promoted or as their responsibilities are increasing or they're struggling or whatever. And I thought, what if we applied some of the basic principles for how you develop a training program for athletes? Is there any application if I look at leadership? And I found out there was an enormous crossover in terms of the basic concepts and how you put them together. And so it's not so much introducing new ideas, like new leadership concepts. It's more of how do they all fit together and what's a sequence that makes them, puts handles on them so people know how to actually apply them and work with them. And that's really the concept of the book, The Lead, is that.
Okay. So let's take a scenario here, if you wouldn't mind playing with me on this, right? So
Yeah.
one of the skills that we hear a lot that leaders need to develop is the skill of being able to manage conflict or to give and provide what might be considered tough news, right?
Yeah.
And I even remember reading, again, I'm pulling up Harvard again in my memory, that it was one of those large, important, top of the list skills for leaders to have. And I think most people could kind of go, yeah, that's not an easy one. We don't like conflict, we avoid it. And whole cultures are sort of evolve around the avoidance of conflict, right?
Yeah.
So if we know that that's a skill that we need to have, right? Like throwing a ball is a skill that we need for football. Conflict is a skill we need for a good leader in an organization.
Right.
So we can provide them crucial conversations, books. We can go to TED Talks and see stuff on conflict. We can listen to all sorts of people, espouse what they think is a good process. What is your take on how we can apply this? Not the new idea, but the way to translate it into a real measurable action. What is your point of view on how to do that?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things. My first book is actually called Conflict and Leadership, so it's all about this topic. But there's two parts of it, I think, that are different. So almost all of the literature on conflict resolution, if you and I were in a conflict, almost all of the literature, and we were partners in a business, let's say, almost all the literature would be about how do you and I have a conversation around this. Like almost all of it has to do with the relational dynamic. And what I suggest, and this is really just how it works, is I encourage leaders to view conflict as an opportunity, because if there's an issue between the two of us, for example, then there's likely to be something that's important to at least one of us, if not both of us, that we both feel it's at risk. And so we're getting down to some deep desires or interests on the part of both of us. And if we can understand those about each other, then our level of relationship can really potentially grow. But the other thing that shows up, and this is really the difference. So what I just discussed would be interest-based conflict resolution or interest-based mediation or facilitation. And that's a fairly standard, that's the getting to yes, if you're familiar with some of that earlier work that was written. What I suggest that's in addition to this is, in my experience, because I'm a mediator, part of my background is, and I found that you could brute force organizational disputes with many, many, many hours of mediation and come successfully to conclusions. but I started seeing these themes. And almost all of the themes are there's a cultural issue or there's a systemic or structural issue. In other words, roles and responsibilities oftentimes are not well defined. Or, as you said, there's a culture of avoidance. Those are two common dynamics. They're not the only ones. And so if you go back and you actually just do a better job defining roles and responsibilities, clarifying expectations, an enormous amount of conflict just disappears downstream. And so all these skills
Agree
in terms of
100%.
conflict, yeah. So that's a
Yeah.
lot of
Go,
it.
sorry, keep going.
Yeah. No, so that's the concept around that is I think most conflict can be resolved by addressing these bigger picture questions of culture, conflict avoidance, and culture comes back to the individual. So if I run a company and it's a conflict avoidant culture, it can be guaranteed that I'm conflict avoidant as an individual, and I've taught my company to reflect this in some way, or there's some unhealthy way of relating to conflict. And so the other side of the equation, once this macro level, the other side is looking at how do I as a leader individually relate to conflict, relate to feeling threatened, relate to issues that create fear for me, relate to whatever that touches in me, identity, ego, any of those kinds of things, because my personal confidence and health in those areas will inevitably impact how I relate and perceive conflict. And so I encourage growth personally, because then I can show up in conflict in a much healthier state. But then I also encourage working on some of these larger levels within an organization. That's kind of a lot I'm trying to pack into
So,
that show.
no, it's good stuff. So, if I were to go back and sort of rethink what you said, what I'm sort of hearing you say is that on one hand, we need to, if we take a look at just this example of conflict, right? We could come up with many others. That if we go back and realize that conflict is being encouraged in some ways, or I should say, let me restate that. The poor management of conflict is being, in a sense, encouraged by a culture of avoidance. So we have got to sort of trace it back to its source. Right. It also could be about how we are structured, the roles and responsibilities, or in fact, the lack thereof. Get that?
Right.
And then you also mentioned the fact that conflict needs to be sort of sourced back to the individual. How do I deal with it? What's my history regarding that? How do I feel about it, and so forth? I think that's great. Give me the connective tissue back to the sports metaphor. How has your work in sports been able to be predictive in its process to be able to create peak performance at a particular time and day? How does that then relate to our example regarding building a person who is better at conflict?
Yeah. So in fitness performance, you stack capacities on top of each other. You don't just train everything all at once. So you initially start out with making sure people have a base in nutrition and so on. Then you have a basic in conditioning. You prepare the body for stress. Then you build strength, which is the ability to act and create movement. And then you have power. Power is the ability to do that quickly. And the translation to leadership is power is the ability to act in a situation, not to control the typical way we use power in leadership, which is to dominate or control. The way I use the term power, at least in this context, is the ability to act quickly and decisively to either force a change in direction of something or to create momentum in some way. And that's the kind of physics response of power. So I identify leading change, leading conflict, and dealing with crises as three areas where leaders need to be able to exercise power to either force momentum to break through something or to create change. And so conflict, being one of these key skills, is something where you have to somehow catch it and create change, because conflict's momentum is going to take it in a direction that's destructive and toxic nearly always, unless a leader intervenes and forces change in the nature of that conversation or the relationship. That's the connection that I'm building there with
I get it now. So the sports analogy is around stacking and sequencing in order for an athlete to be at their peak performance for a particular heat or meet or what have you. Stacking and sequencing is also important in terms of learning a skill that you could actually, in a positive, powerful way, execute against that.
Right.
So what I sort of think what you're almost coming up with a design approach to leadership development. It's not just here's a whole cacophony of skills, go out there and try them out and good
No,
luck.
no.
It's more like here's a bunch of skills out there, here's a bunch of tools and techniques and methods, but the way we stack them, the way we sequence them is
Yeah.
extremely important in your ability to be able to be effective at that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you mentioned we were both
Okay.
leadership nerds. So if I can just nerd for a second,
Nerd away, baby.
All right. This is based off of in the fitness world, it's called periodization. Usually only coaches and trainers would know about that. But it's this concept where you just spend in cycles, usually 90-day cycles. It can be more or less. But you do a tight focus on a certain area of development, and then you shift. And you keep shifting. So you shift through strength, power, through endurance, through mobility and recovery, and then back through strength. And so I identify a number of core leadership strengths, core leadership power, abilities, core leadership concepts relating to endurance and the ability to recover and to maintain longevity. And then you kind of cycle through this. And the idea being, if leaders come in and they say, well, I need to learn to become an emotionally intelligent leader. And I'm just going to work hard on that because I don't feel like I get that very well. I'm a very, concrete thinker and I like to get things done. But I'm realizing my team's, feeling raw around me. If that's all I try to do, it wears myself out. It wears the team out. And I'm not growing in areas where I also need other growth. And the reality is you can only handle so much growth in one space, most people. And then you kind of fatigue out and you kind of have to switch it up. And so just applying those concepts so people, because I believe leadership development is not something you do for a weekend or for 6 months with a coach. I think it's like fitness. Like you have to constantly work at it because to me, leadership is not so much a skill, it's who you are. And if you want to be an effective leader, you have to really build yourself as a person. Otherwise the skills always kind of fall apart because they're built off of who you are as a person.
So, Christian, I've not read your book yet, but I plan on doing it. What I'm getting is that there's an art form, much like a great athletic coach would know this, based on what you're saying around the sequence and the stacking, the timing, the recovery, moving through these different domains, playing upon momentum, making sure you don't burn out the system. If I'm listening to this and I'm going like, that sounds right, makes sense, right? I'm not going to make a Michelin star meal if I haven't figured out how to, boil rice, so there's a certain kind of stacking that takes place.
Yeah.
Do you provide in the book that, is the stacking something you're teaching, or are you providing what the stacking should be? Meaning, are you providing the framework for the stacking and sequencing, or are you providing the recipe of what, all right, if you want to be able to learn coaching skills, these are the stacking and sequencing processes you need, or are you providing more of the framework? I guess that's what I'm questioning.
So what I'm providing is, I love the question. Thank you for asking that. The way I wrote the book is I modeled it after well-written fitness books that teach you the concepts of fitness and then give you training plans and help you understand why this plan fits with the concepts they're teaching you. And so I introduced 25 or so basic leadership skills or concepts in the book. Each one has an exercise or a number of exercises so that you can immediately go out and practice it that day. And then I have 3 training plans in the book. So for brand new leaders, there's a training plan that's already custom built with room for them to adjust it if they want to, so they can begin putting it into place themselves. One for intermediate level leaders and then one for advanced or experienced leaders, where they can realize, how do I go through these things? Because some of the advanced skills in the book only make sense if you're a leader with executive level position. or they make more sense at that level. So they're harder to practice if you're a brand new frontline leader. That's another area where leadership development programs often fail. Like early in my career, I'd be asked to teach strategic planning to mid-level leaders. They can't use it. They can't practice it. And what happens is they all just end up complaining about, why haven't their senior leaders involved them in the strategic plan or taught them this? And so I think a lot of times understanding which leadership concepts can you actually use given a level of leadership is important. So I built the book to help people navigate that. And somebody can come in and just basically follow the book and put themselves on a self-coaching. I think it's always better to work with a coach. But if somebody's motivated and driven, they can coach themselves through a leadership development process that will produce results for them.
And when you say will produce results, in sports, if you're, MMA fighter, or if you're a basketball player, or you're a swimmer, you have a way in which to measure your performance by virtue of whether you took this person down, whether you were the fastest one to reach the other end of the pool, whatever. You have stats up the yin yang, of course, when it comes to, take a look at football and basketball. There's so many stats, it's ridiculous. How do we then develop the right stats? How do we develop the right measurement tools to be able to say this person who's gone through this sequenced stacking approach to be able to say, yes, I've actually learned this? Because that's one of the other things that I think we sometimes suffer within training and development as an industry, is that we don't know how to measure this. And we don't have any standards by which to measure it. I mean, is it competency based? Is it based on the surveys of, people observing? Is it a 360? Is it business results? How do you propose people measure their mastery of a leadership skill?
Yeah. So the way in my coaching, and this is what I would propose to people that are using the book as well, is, there are lots of different ways to do that. And you can look at bottom line performance. You can look at things like that in companies. The way that I use it is, I think those things matter. Clients definitely think those things matter. And they do. But what I use to measure progress is what stakeholders feel like happened. So I'm not a huge fan of what I call black box coaching, where just I meet with the client and we both talk for 6 months or a year and then walk away declaring a success. I feel like that's, there's a conflict of interest in that. What I like to do is I feel like all leadership happens within a relationship. It can only exist within the context of a relationship. And even though I think real things happen, what really matters is the perception of the stakeholders. So the people being led or the people who depend on the success of the leader matters enormously. And so a leader can change and be doing all the right things. And if the stakeholder still views them as being toxic or overbearing or not showing enough initiative or whatever the thing is, then that perception matters. And it actually changes the effectiveness of the leader. And so you have to have the perception change for that leader to be maximally effective. And so, because if a leader's trying to lead somebody, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. Yeah, there's obviously a delay here. The follow-up question I want to ask you is, and I'm sorry for interrupting you there, but I'll get it out. I get the fact that you had just mentioned that the stakeholders, the people that leader is in relationship with, that person's perspective should be used as a metric. And I agree with you on that. I'm going to split hairs a little bit on that one.
Okay.
Because the metric, sometimes the perception that others have of that leader may be influenced by their own baggage that might be clouding their judgment of that leader, right? Because it is a relationship, right? Yes, you've changed, but I still cannot help what you said 4 years ago, right? It's not a clean, precise, accurate representation because you have that person's baggage, that person's mindset, that person's history being used as a filter for how they see that leader. And so sometimes, because we get this a lot with 360s, like some of it you have to take with a grain of salt, right? So I guess, how do you manage that part?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I just dealt with a similar dynamic like that with a client. where everybody except for the senior leader saw progress with the individual. And so but that's legitimate, right? If the senior leader doesn't see it, that's an issue. That's a real thing. The person may have progressed, but the person who was most important didn't see it. So in that case, I just asked them, and I think that's what it should do, is it should provoke more conversation. Like if one person seems stuck on something and everyone else sees growth, then you obviously have an outlier. Why is that
Hmm.
outlier there? I don't know. Maybe there's a different relationship between those two people and everyone else is experiencing something different. That's possible. In this case, I think that the senior leader doesn't see this individual in action very often, so they don't see certain things. And I think also they're carrying some stuff. They're not letting go of certain things. And so I just asked him, are either of these possibly true? And he stopped
Understood.
and he thought about it. And so I think that's partially right. So 360s are always only subjective reflections, of how people see a leader. But that's the
Right.
context a leader's operating in. And I think when you get these outliers or these anomalies, if we're using the tools well, we're taking the next step, which is what's going on here. Like this should provoke another question or another exploration. That's where it's helpful. If you're just reading the book itself or you're kind of walking yourself through leadership development, it can be harder to do that. And that's where it can be helpful to have a coach or someone like that because they're on the outside and they're talking to all the people. And that's a benefit. So that's kind of the difference between training by yourself and having someone who's able to work with you. You can do it both ways. There's an advantage to having help.
So when you mention the black box approach to coaching, I guess what you're proposing or advocating for is the occasional or frequent engagement of those people that would benefit from the improvement of that leader,
Yeah. The
or
way I
engage
do
them
it
in,
is
like, how is this going?
I I
Yeah.
I have my clients do this on a monthly basis. So I do a 360 set of interviews at the beginning of a process.
Mm.
And then we identify one really tightly defined goal. And I have my clients go back to their stakeholder group and I coach them on how to do this. But they go back once a month and ask them for input. We call it feed forward. This is all language I got from Marshall Goldsmith. So
Oh,
the
yeah.
on how I'm pursuing this goal. What are recommendations for how I can continue to pursue this over the next month? And this regular re-asking of the question almost always uh, addresses this issue of people that are dealing with transference or are dealing with kind of old perspectives because they're on a monthly
Uh huh.
basis being asked to reevaluate their perspective. Then on top of that, at least twice an engagement, if not more often, I'll send out a mini survey. So there's a lot. I would say it's a hard coaching process to go through, but it produces results. And partially it's because there's so much transparency and so much accountability um, that it just drives things forward. It's
And
hard
it
to
would
stay still
obviously,
in that environment.
yeah, if you're doing a coaching situation like what you're proposing, it sounds like the frequency of the coaching would need to be what, a couple times a month more?
Yeah, I find with coaching, if we're actually pursuing a specific goal, as opposed to mentoring, where somebody might just call me when they need me. The With coaching, I found usually if I meet with somebody less than twice a month, then usually they don't gain momentum.
Agreed.
And so most of my clients, it's between 2 to 4 times a month that we meet, depending on what they need.
Yeah, that's something I always tell people. If we're in maintenance mode, if we're in mentor mode, once a month is fine. But if we're
Yeah,
starting up, we want to get momentum. You absolutely need to be doing it twice a month or more because you go back to your work, you go back to all those triggers that bring you back to your old behavior. How are you going to be able to move past, go upstream, if you will, of the culture of the other people if you don't have some reinforcement, if you don't have that stacking, going back to what you said before? I
right,
want to ask
right.
another question. I remember once, Christian, reading a book that kind of has always stuck with me, and you bring in this metaphor of athletics into leadership development. And you probably read it, but I want to get your reaction to it and see how it fits into your model. It's called The Powerful Engagement by Tony Schwartz. And if you haven't read the book, and I'll just quickly give you a quick synopsis of it, they did some
The power
studies
of
years
full
ago about the process for performance. Sorry,
the power of full engagement.
powerful engagement.
That's a fantastic book. I love it.
You've read it. Yeah. So
Yeah.
I don't need to explain it to you, but for those of you who are listening in on this, great book, probably 15 years old, but basically
Yeah.
it was a study around what creates performance in athletics. And they found certain telltale signs. And then they said, well, what is the performance, mindset for business? They're very, very different. And so the idea was, could we take some of those lessons learned from athletics and apply them into business? Primarily, it had to do with things like stress and exertion and repair, and being able to have certain rituals for peak performance, and to be able to apply that into a business situation. The comment that I always remember was, if we applied the kind of performance process that we do in business into athletics, we would see a lot more injuries, a lot fewer world records being broken, and
Right.
a lot less interesting sports to watch, because we would never
Right.
see any progression, right? So it's a great analogy. But I guess from that book, and I think it really had a lot to do with things like rituals, things like taking care of yourself. You don't throw an entire game, pitch an entire game, and expect to pitch the next game. The next game, you're probably in ice packs because your arm is sore, right? But we don't do that at work. But does that
Right.
perspective around that self-care that athletes do so well? They got chiropractors and massage therapists, and they're
Yep.
going in and out of, ice baths and so forth. How does that apply to your model?
It applies greatly to the model. I mean, the beginning of the model starts out with this idea of nutrition and influences that we have in our life. And so, I mean, anybody that's involved in fitness seriously agrees and understands with the saying that six-pack abs are made in the kitchen. And so there's this idea that if you get on the treadmill or you go do your high intensity interval training or whatever the thing is, throw a barbell around a bunch, that's how you get in shape or stay healthy. But most of fitness actually comes from the things that you put into your body, and putting good things into your body, not putting in bad things. That's the majority of fitness. Yes. Eating well, sleeping well, drinking enough water. If you just do that, you've yes. done an awful lot. And so what I look at is, what are the major influences that people bring into their life? The relationships that they have, the media that they consume, the concepts that they're allowing to bring into their life, and to what degree are they curating them so that they're bringing in healthy perspectives. So that's one part of it, is walking the readers through a series of questions and concepts that ask them to explore the influences that they're bringing into your life, understanding that as like a nutrition perspective. Then the other side is what I call conditioning, or it's conditioning. And that has to do with how you physically is how you prepare your body to adapt to stress. And what the leadership parallel that I pulled from that had to do with just basic self-management. And so most leaders, I find, even when I do executive coaching, most of their issues or challenges come from self-management, not from doing higher level leadership skills. It's the fact that it goes back to the power of full engagement. They don't manage their energy well. They don't manage their time well. They don't understand their priorities well. They have a hard time being appropriately patient for things and letting things come to fruition. So they start 18 things at once and then max themselves out and burn themselves out. They have a hard time following through on things. So basic self-management principles that aren't necessarily leadership in and of themselves, but if all you do are those, you're going to be dramatically a better leader than most leaders, just because you can manage yourself. And
it's
so that's a great thing that you said there. How I handle that at the beginning is working on those. Then at the end, I talk about, long-term recovery elements, pacing, pulling from the powerful engagement concepts, actually. How do you not go at 100%? Actually, a coaching session I had just before this call. One of my recommendations to the client was this idea of finding his rhythm through the week, not at 100% all week long, but building in a pacing and a cycle for pacing to do that.
Yeah, it's a great concept that book talks about. I think you already sort of touched upon it, about managing your energy,
Yeah.
not your time. And
Yeah.
that we get it all the time. You and me, Christian, you know it. We get, oh, I'm so stressed out. I got so much to do.
Yeah.
I had a call with 6 different people from a healthcare organization. That's what they wanted to talk about, was how do you get more done? Aside from a culture of saying yes and never saying no. And you've got a culture that they don't manage energy, they manage time. And of course, there's a finite amount of that. So if there's one thing that people come away with this conversation that Christian's talking about is getting that down. I think that would be an excellent idea. So Christian, tell people how they could find out more about you, your book, the work that you're all about.
Yeah, the best way to reach me is just on my website, www.christianmuntean.com. And everything about me is there. Tons of free resources if people are looking for resources on leadership, on conflict resolution, on any of those topics. They can connect with me on LinkedIn. The book's available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, kind of anywhere you can get a book.
Excuse me. Well, that's great. I mean, it's really fascinating stuff you're talking about. I love the analogy. It makes sense. It's not just a gimmick, a new flashy idea. Like, oh, we got a new idea around leadership, right? It actually makes sense to be able to use something that we already have evidence to prove, which is around sports and athletics, and that sequencing, that stacking, and the work that you talked about with respect to and managing energy makes a lot of sense. I really appreciate your thoughts and your energy, and I'm definitely going to get the book.
Yeah, well, thank you. I appreciate that. We can get a copy to you.
Sounds great.
Thank you for listening to Leadervation with Dean Newlund. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to learn more about Dean or Mission Facilitators Leadership, go to mfileadership.com. That's mfileadership.com, or check the show notes. Reimagine, facilitate, flourish. Transform your leadership success with Leadervation.